Hello everyone and welcome yet again to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in. Hope you guys enjoyed your 4th of July's out celebrating with either friends or family, as you should. But today on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, I have a show chock full of player profiles. In fact, every single segment is going to feature a certain player profile. So, without further ado, let's jump right into today's show. But before we do, I do want to ask that you like, follow, and subscribe to both the show and the network. It is a huge support to all of us doing our thing here. Also, if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network as a whole. So, anything you leave is greatly appreciated. Also, if you have any burning questions, comments, or concerns about prior segments I have done, or even segments from today's show, all of them can be left here and addressed at the beginning of the next episode. So without further ado, let's jump right into today's show. Let's start off with a player profile concerning someone who has always been seen as a wide receiver 2 in this league. On a team that preaches speed, he is seen as one of those guys who is either 1A or 2 on the field at all times. And that, of course, is Jaylen Waddle. Jaylen Waddle has always kind of played second fiddle to Tyreek Hill in the Miami Dolphins offense. However, I do still think he has merit as a wide receiver 2 in your fantasy team, and here is why. Without further ado, let's jump right into his stats. Throughout his career, he's amassed 452.6 fantasy points. His best season was in 2022, where he had 184.2 fantasy points. Last year, he was right where you would expect someone who was a wide receiver 2 in a certain offense to be. In terms of fantasy, he was the wide receiver 21 overall. However, here's something of concern. In an offense that definitely preaches verticality, he was outside the top 50 in terms of deep targets and looks in the red zone. So as you can see, Jaylen Waddle is not necessarily used to stretch the field as much as Tyreek Hill is in that system. And so that's one caveat that I can mention right now off the top of my head. Also, he was only the wide receiver 27 in expected fantasy points per game, although he was 5th in yards per route run and 6th in first downs per route run. So he made the most of whatever targets he saw. And next year, fantasy odds do project him to step up and kind of be assuming of the mantle of a wide receiver 1, potentially. Not necessarily there yet, but still. He's projected to have 1,075 yards, only 5 touchdowns, because, as you know, he's not always used in the red zone as much as a guy like Tyreek Hill or even some Dolphins tight ends, for a grand total of 142 fantasy points. So, the story of Jaylen Waddle goes, he was going to be perhaps the wide receiver 1 for the Miami Dolphins for years to come, but then they saw that they could get Tyreek Hill, and that's exactly what they did. And once Tyreek Hill comes into a team, all the dynamics concerning the wide receiver room are centered around him. And so Jaylen Waddle kind of fell by the wayside a little bit. However, as we've seen, Tyreek Hill is prone to injury, especially now in Miami. So therefore, that should mean Jaylen Waddle can and will step into that wide receiver 1 role whenever Tyreek Hill goes down like that. It's very rare, but when he is, that's perhaps the reason why so many people value him a bit higher than other wide receiver 2s in this league, is because Tua is unafraid to go to him when, Tyreek Hill either isn't on his game or is injured. And so Jaylen Waddle will never necessarily be someone you immediately go out and say, yes, I want you on my fantasy team. He will always be a guy who you kind of gloss over a little bit. I think that concerning a good wide receiver 2, you want at least 12 to 15 points from them. Obviously, your top gun is going to be the guy who gets you like 20 to 25, and then your wide receiver 2 is 12 to 15 in that range in terms of fantasy points. Jaylen Waddle can certainly get that. However, the Miami Dolphins offense, I feel like, and this is weird to say, is going to evolve more around the running game. Now, why would I say such a thing when they have someone like Tyreek Hill? And also, while I think that Jaylen Waddle is certainly a good, solid, serviceable wide receiver too, because of the fact that in a contract year for Tua, when he hasn't really proved as much of himself as he would like, things definitely feel like they could be changing. And so, while I do see both of these wide receivers' volumes still remaining high, I think that as a whole, there is concern in what these two will do together, because when you look at the whole scope and you zero in on specific members of the Miami Dolphins offense, the one kind of underlying theme is that Tua lets them down. And so, in order for Tua to kind of find his feet again, perhaps they lean more on the run game in the early goings. Therefore, Jaylen Waddle becomes more of, say, a decoy early on. He's not necessarily the bright spot in the offense early on. I think from the get-go, in order for the Dolphins to fully believe that Tua can get going, I think the running backs will have to get going. And thus, Jaylen Waddle falls even more down the pecking order in people's minds. The silver lining to all this, though, is that in terms of targets and production, Tua does seem very attuned to understanding that Tyreek Hill can't always be the focal point. When Tua is tasked with throwing the football, whenever in the season, you know that Tyreek Hill, more often than not, will always be open. It's in his nature, it's due to his speed, it's due to his electricity in this team. But Jaylen Waddle, as we've seen in his stats, with the production he receives, makes more out of it. So therefore, Jaylen Waddle's more or less approach certainly could help him. Maybe not in the touchdown department, but definitely in producing in this system, in this offense, and getting as much yardage as he can. Also, if you're in a PPR league, that really stands out because some wide receiver twos are going to be placed at a premium. A lot of people are going to go for the big stars because they know that their attention is always going to be on those guys who can get them the most targets and the most receptions possible. However, wide receiver twos are still important in that regard due to the fact that there are very few to come by who are as good as Jaylen Waddle. And so, I definitely advocate for Jaylen Waddle as more of a PPR wide receiver because it suits him more for what his role is in this offense. He's not the prolific guy who's going to get you 20 to 25 fantasy points in either of those leagues. He's not going to be the guy who, is going to take a 5-yard gain and make it a 30-yard one. And I don't think he's going to ever be the focal point of what the Dolphins go through. I don't think he's ever going to be the leader of the wide receiver room unless, Tyreek Hill up and leaves or something happens. So I truly believe that Jaylen Waddle's value lies in the area of wide receiver twos. Now, like I said though, the Miami Dolphins will always be an attractive team in terms of fantasy, no matter what. But looking at last year, and looking at how everyone evolved in that system, it certainly did not seem to favor Jaylen Waddle. And let me give you an example. Last year, Jaylen Waddle was on my fantasy team. And there were moments where, he was right at the wide receiver 2 threshold, and I was happy with him. He was getting consistently 14, 16 points per game. And almost exactly what I needed from him. However, like I said, Tyreek Hill went down. In those games, it certainly felt like the Dolphins were more predicated on running the football and being more risk-averse than throwing it to Jaylen Waddle. For some reason, there is a disconnect whenever Tyreek Hill is off the field between Jaylen Waddle and what the Miami Dolphins want to do on offense. Now, I'm not saying it's a dig at him, but it's certainly something that is cause for concern, because when a wide receiver 1 goes down, you want someone who's just as reliable. And I can't say that Jaylen Waddle is right there at this very moment in time. I think he's serviceable. I think he's certainly, when Tyreek Hill is on the field, a fantastic wide receiver 2 in support of Tyreek Hill. But he certainly lacks in the department of elevating a team that when something goes awry, you need that one guy. And that's why I certainly have trepidations surrounding what Jaylen Waddle is going to be next year and what the Miami Dolphins offense is going to do with him. Because right now it's looking very murky as to what Jaylen Waddle's role is going to be in the very near future. But that should just about do it for this segment. I hope you guys enjoyed it, because Jaylen Waddle is such an interesting player to diagnose because of his fascinating wide receiver 2 status on the Dolphins. Coming up next, we have a quarterback who certainly will have everyone's attention next year. In his second year in the league, hopefully a full season we'll see from him. Hint as to who that is. Coming up right after the break. It should be a good one. We'll be right back on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. 'Cause every